legal instruments into laws that at least, many lawyers, many former judges argue is against the Constitution, that it's non-constitutional to actually base citizenship, even in this very limited case of refugees, on religious criteria. It's in the Supreme Court right now being adjudicated, but the Supreme Court has been very right-wing in recent months and years, so we're not holding our breath on that. Okay. The final twist, however, is the NRC. In essence, this law cancels the citizenship of every citizen in India. Think about the remarkable nature of such an event. That the citizenship of every single supposed citizen in India will be cancelled, and the burden then will be on individuals and families to provide proof of origin and residence and so on in order to regain their citizenship. It's an extraordinary gesture. I don't know really of any recent such event or initiative really anywhere in the world. There must be, but I'm not aware of it. Okay. And as you can imagine, we are talking about South Asian society, how many families, will have no papers to show, and especially among the poorer segments of the population, among the oppressed castes, and so on. And existing documents like the voter card, on the basis of which the government has been elected, after all, will not be accepted as proof of citizenship. Social welfare cards, already issued and used for years, will not be accepted as proof of citizenship. Your passport will not be accepted as proof of citizenship. So what you have to do is provide documents about your parents, your grandparents, and so on and so forth, about their residence, their birth document. Birth certificates in India and Pakistan. I don't have a birth certificate, a legal birth certificate, in the way in which the modern birth certificate is conceived. My father didn't even know his date of birth. He was born in Varanasi, in Banaras. So you can imagine what this means, the mayhem that will be created, and this massive concentration of sovereign power right at the top of the society, of the political structure rather, into the hands of the highest segments of the ruling party, basically, right? Modi and Amit Shah in particular. Amit Shah, as the Home Minister, is the enforcer of the mafia boss that is Modi. He's enforcing these things. Okay. So obviously millions will be unable to provide documents and will be defined as aliens under the NRC. This is where the CAA kicks in. And Amit Shah has said in a statement, the Home Minister has said in a statement in Parliament, कि आप इसकी chronology समझिए, because he's saying that two laws are going to apply in a certain order, okay, in a certain temporal order. So you cancel everybody's citizenship and then have them provide proofs. Many millions will fall out of this sort of sieve, as it were, right? And will be listed as aliens. And then the CAA kicks in, okay? And because of the terms of the CAA, it is said, non-Muslims then could be reincorporated into the citizenry. But millions of Muslims perhaps, and some people are saying it could be tens of millions, could become permanently aliens, because there is no law for their normalization or renormalization, naturalization as citizens, once their citizenship has been annulled like that of everyone else, and once they have failed the test of the NRC and been unable to provide the requisite documents to prove that they are indeed Indians. It's an extraordinary act of the concentration of power. The citizenry that voted in the government is going to have its citizenship cancelled. Okay? And then the citizenry is going to be reconstituted according to the terms that this government wants, and so on. So it's an extraordinary power play that this BJP government, which is of course emboldened by last year's election results, where it got an outright majority in the Lok Sabha. First time any party has done that, I think, in many decades. Kamran, am I right? In many decades, I believe. But only on the basis of about, I think, around 30% of the vote, because of obviously the parliamentary first past the post system. Okay. So emboldened by that victory, this is the second big action against Muslims that this government is attempting, after, of course, the cancellation of Article 370 of the Constitution and the splitting up of Jammu Kashmir state into union territories, which can be ruled directly from the center without any even pretense of democracy in any way, permanently. Just permanently ruled from the center. So this is where the Dadis of Shaheen Bagh come in. I had brought a video, but I'm afraid it didn't work out for some reason. There was a copyright or something. Or? And this name has caught on, the Dadis of Shaheen Bagh, because some of these ladies are literally like in their 80s, okay, and very visible and very, very vocal and extremely sophisticated, actually, in the ways that they can barely even speak standard Hindi, okay, let alone English or Urdu. They speak their local dialects, whichever part of North India they happen to be from. And they are speaking in very sophisticated terms, okay, about what it is they are doing. They see it as not a Muslim movement, but a multi-denominational movement in which all the oppressed and minority populations in India, all the groups that have been that are outside of this vision of India that the BJP represents, at the center of which are, of course, upper caste Hindu populations. They see themselves as leading a movement for all these marginalized populations in India and talk about it very openly that way, and speak, for instance, about the Dalits, which is an amazing thing that these Muslim families, Muslim women see themselves as allied with the Dalit struggle, the formerly untouchables, as it were. And in fact, Dalit leaders like Chandrasekhar Azad has himself allied himself with them, and so on. And in this movement, people are speaking always about how they want to let these women retain the leadership. They don't want to take over the movement, and they want to keep the political parties out. The big leaders are kept away from these protests, even when they want to come. And they are willing to follow their lead. It's an extraordinary and unprecedented sort of development. Modi, being Modi, has tried to suggest that the protesters are not, as it were, the people. That these people on that roadway and in every other such demonstration across the country, that they are not the people, the demos in the word democracy, right? The Greek word, the word English word democracy has the Greek word demos as its first half, the people, government by the people. And he has suggested in very interesting ways, the language is very interesting, that this is not the people, this is not the demos of India, but rather the primordial enemies of the people. The Muslims, the Pakistani state, even Islam as a whole. The way he has described it is, he says, इनके कपड़ों से पता चल जाता है कि ये कौन लोग हैं. And of course, we're talking about women with hijab of various sorts, or men in skull caps and kurta pajama and the rest of it. So what he's trying to do is he is saying to his constituency, we can read, we can decode what is happening here, and just by looking at them, by their mode of visibility, we can say that this is not the people in revolt. This is in fact the opposite. It's the enemy of the people that is making this noise, and they are, of course, perennial source of violence and so on. The Muslim terrorists, by definition, in their imagination. But the remarkable thing is that it's not really working. Okay, it's not really working, and the movement is growing. It's impossible to say where it's going to go, how long the protests of this sort, the sit-ins, might continue. And by the way, they have some of the exact same features of these occupation movements and assembly movements in Europe and America a few years ago, in New York against Wall Street, in Istanbul against Erdogan's policies, in Athens against the austerity regime that was being forced upon Greece, and so on. For instance, they refuse to allow a leadership to emerge, and they take votes among whoever happens to be present. Okay, all these very interesting features of what is sometimes seen as the most advanced forms of protest politics in the Western world. Obviously, they're not aware of those movements, I'm certain of that, but they seem to be emerging simply out of the experience of protest itself. So these tactics of the BJP are not working, and a huge movement has arisen that openly acknowledges the leading role of the dadis. Okay, it's interesting to me also that it's dadis and not nannies. You know, it's the matriarch. You know, it's the mother with sons, as it were, and that whole sense of the power of South Asian, of women in South Asian families once they reach a certain stage in life and in the life cycle and so on. Okay, so that's the first threat, the dadis of Shaheen Bagh. The second threat concerns this question of the presence of poetry in these protests. We are all familiar with that. Poetic expression, even slogans that are really very poetic in nature, that gets spontaneously composed and so on. Very standard features of demonstrations and protest movements in South Asia. We're very familiar with that. The right does it too. It's not just the left that does it, right? The present protests started in a handful of universities. I'm not sure people are aware of that. In particular in JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, the Jamia Millia Islamia, and the Aligarh Muslim University in Aligarh. Now the interesting thing is to find, of course, I mean, for someone like me, a Pakistani, that is to say I'm not Indian, I've not lived there all these decades, although I have a strong connection with Delhi. I've in the past spent a lot of time there, but now the visas are becoming impossible. But anyway, I've not had a living, continued kind of experience of living there. And of course, Jamia, and I'm a student of the history of sort of Muslims and freedom movement and the Pakistan movement and so on. Jamia and Aligarh were, of course, at the opposite ends of the political debate about who Muslims are, where they belong in India, in an undivided India, or a separate state, and so on. Aligarh was the home of the Pakistan movement by the 1930s, certainly. And Jamia was the nationalist university. It was founded precisely as an alternative to Aligarh, and seen as an Indian nationalist university. M.A. Ansari, Abul Kalam Azad, Hakim Ajmal Khan, all these people in Delhi who helped to found that university. But they are both being tarnished now with the brush of terrorism, tarred with the brush of Muslim terrorists and so on. Okay, and the Shaheen Bagh protest began in earnest against police violence against students at Jamia, where police broke into campus. And there are now new videos have emerged that completely make clear that the students were not being provocative, let alone violent. There were people studying in the library in various places, and the police just went in and lathi charged and beat everybody to a pulp and broke, just broke furniture and things like that. So absolute hooliganism. So these women came out to protest in response to the violence at Jamia, which is also in the same extended neighborhood. And in the student protests that started with the CAA and NRC debate, but even in earlier years, for instance, JNU for several years now has been the center of a massive resistance to measures being taken by the Vice Chancellor, who's been appointed by the BJP government, I believe in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. Very regressive measures, they're introducing Vedic science and, just all these absolutely anti-rationalist and far-right policies of various sorts. Unqualified people who are part of the party apparatus and stuff being appointed to the faculty and so on. Faculty governance being taken away and so on. And students being disciplined and punished in various ways for any kind of political activism. So there's been a big culture of resistance to that at JNU, but also in many other universities. In DU, Delhi University, even longer. There were some protests starting in 2014 against the University Grants Commission. And one of the curious features of all these student protests, Salima Hashmi is here, Faisal's daughter. I'm delighted to be talking about this in your presence, also a little terrified. But one of the extraordinary features of this cultural protest is the use of Faisal's poetry. It's universal. I mean, it's universal. Every day on these campuses, somebody is reciting something. And the most famous and obvious case, of course, is that of this nazm, وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ. But others, like Bol, even ghazals are being recited, which is very dear to my heart, actually. I'm much more interested in some ways in ghazals being recited as protest poems, because it kind of confirms what I've been saying about Faisal's verse for a long time. Okay, so it's been a feature of student protests, at least in Delhi, but actually not only in Delhi, for some years. I've been able to trace it to Delhi University in 2016, that far back in these UGC protests. And I want to show a little clip now, in particular of this extraordinary person called Nandita Narayan, who used to be the president of the Delhi University Teachers Union. And she has introduced the reciting of this poem, I think. I said this to her, and she didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. She's very modest. So I think it goes back at least that far, and maybe it goes back even further. And she developed an extraordinary way of recitation, actually, we'll see very soon. It's very strong language in the sense that it's not easy language, it's not everyday Urdu, Hindi, Hindustani. There's a lot of strong Arabic and Persian vocabulary, and there are all these incredible Islamic and Quranic imagery, right? And so you'll see in a second, she's developed this way of, the first one please, the very first one, the way that she's developed of explaining while she's reciting to her students what the poetry means. शुरू से कीजिएगा please. longer videos of her reciting the entire thing on that. I don't want to take up too much time. So this Nazm in particular really just universally read, and students are doing it, and teachers are doing it, and just ordinary people in the streets are doing it. Shall we show a couple more? Let's do that actually. Go back to. I mean, people just stopping in the middle of the street and holding up a camera and sort of filming themselves reciting it, around Shaheen Bagh, for instance. So this is a student at JNU.
लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे, हम देखेंगे, लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे, हम देखेंगे, वो दिन के जिसका वादा है, हम देखेंगे। जब जुल्मों सितम के कोहे गरा, जब जुल्मों सितम के कोहे गरा, रूरी की तरह उड़ जाएंगे, जब जुल्मों सितम के कोहे गरा, रूरी की तरह उड़ जाएंगे, हम महकूमों के पाँव तले, ये धरती धड़ धड़ धड़केगी, और अहले हकम के सरों पर, और अहले हकम के सरों पर जब बिजली कड़कड़ कड़केगी, हम देखेंगे, लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे, हम देखेंगे, वो दिन के जिसका वादा है, हम देखेंगे, जो लाहे अज़ल में लिखा है, हम देखेंगे, लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे, हम देखेंगे, जब अर्ज़े खुदा के काबे से, जब अर्ज़े खुदा के काबे से सब बुत उठवाए जाएंगे, हम अहले सफा मरदूदे हरम मसनद पे बिठाए जाएंगे, सब ताज
So it's just so common, I can't tell you. I mean, there are literally thousands of occasions that you would be able to find if you started looking for them without much difficulty, where this takes place. The strange thing is that until the beginning of the CAA NRC protest, this remained largely unremarked upon. And everybody knew, because the student protests in earlier moments of an earlier sort, either at JNU or DU or any other university, they would be videoed and put on social media, and people were seeing them. There would be, TV reporters were there filming and interviewing the students and so on. But for some reason, this was not really questioned. Why are they singing this particular poem? And given its Islamic vocabulary, given its Pakistani origin and so on, until the CAA protest happened and until this sort of performance, this kind of performance entered into these particular debates. And then in January, a very strange thing happened, which is that in Kanpur, this North Indian town of Kanpur, at the Indian Institute of Technology there, students were filmed singing Hum Dekhenge, let's just call it that. And a faculty member filed a complaint against these students with the university for chanting or reciting an anti-Hindu poem, he said. That was the accusation, that the poem was anti-Hindu and that the university should investigate it. And the university, stupidly enough, started an investigation. Well, this went absolutely viral. I mean, the country was just talking about nothing else for the next several weeks. Thousands of intervention on both sides of the argument. People reading Fair Sahab's Nazm, parsing it, in detail on TV and in social media and so on. Quite an extraordinary thing. The whole country talking about this Urdu Nazm written by a poet who was born, of course, in undivided India, but associated in many ways with this country, of course. Okay. And the extraordinary thing is that this charge of treason and anti-Hindu and all of this has had no effect on the life of this Nazm in these protests. If anything, the students have doubled down, and it's being sung even more often and more intensely and intensively throughout these protests. It's been translated into many, many Indian languages. I've heard a Tamil version, a Malayalam version, Kannada version, Marathi version, extraordinary kind of stuff. All kinds of artists have taken up the Nazm, filming performances around it, or there's another video I can't show now, at Shaheen Bagh, of a group of young women performers who have incorporated it into this extraordinary performance, including other texts and other slogans and well-known political aphorisms in Indian political culture and so on, some of which date back to the days of Bhagat Singh. So this charge of being anti-Hindu has had no effect on the people who are being accused of it, and in many ways they've doubled down and completely sort of gone beyond those accusations. So it's completely failed, that campaign. Okay, so what's going on? Well, one of the things I think that is remarkable here that is emerging in this incident or set of incidents and controversy and so on, what is becoming clear that perhaps more than any other modern poet in South Asia, Fair Sahab is a poet of an undivided Indian civilization, which he approaches, of course, through a very Islamic idiom in many ways, drawn from traditions of tasawwuf and so on, but that in many ways in profound ways is not exclusive to the Islamic tradition, in ways, for instance, that the language of Iqbal could sometimes be, but in Faisal's verse, it seems to me, there is this extraordinary ambition to embrace this entire civilization, at least of North India, in the old sense. And in a lot of his most intimate poetry, the most subjective, the most private poetry, the ghazals and the nazms of the 50s and 60s, this ambition to not just surrender to the process of partition in the way in which, not the political partition, but the partition of a civilization and a culture that, of course, is an ongoing process in many ways, although I think there are counter forces as well that bring the languages and cultures closer together. Sometimes very negative influences like Bollywood. It drives me crazy to see Bollywood Hindi written on billboards in Pakistan. This very Bombaya Chalu Hindustani, but there are all kinds of forces, I think, that are working also working against this process of partitioning in various ways. But official ideologies of various sorts, certainly in Hindi official culture, there is a constant attempt to sort of distinguish Urdu from Hindi and so on. I mean, there are senior scholars of Hindi whom I've spoken to, who have said, oh, no, not the same language at all, two completely separate languages. There's maybe 400 common words. It's an extraordinary way of thinking about the vernacular of North India. There are two forms of the same vernacular. I mean, they are much closer as two forms of this common shared language than, let's say, Texas English and the Queen's English, much closer. So the language, and my second book was really about this question, that the language sort of feels all kinds of pressures which seek to further this process of partition and make the two languages incomprehensible and unavailable to each other. But there are also in society and culture all kinds of forces, I think, that keep undoing that process of partition. And that's a very extraordinary and very beautiful thing, 70 years after partition. Where is my taskmaster? Yes?
We have time for Q&A.
Okay, so you want me to stop now?
Yeah, I think this is good. And we can discuss more during Q&A.
Yeah, we can watch just one more video maybe, if it's there. Yes, the Shine Bagh one. It's just a guy on a street corner who's being filmed near Shine Bagh. So, in a political milieu where one of the slogans of the right is Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko, government ministers are going around saying this at political rallies. Okay? And in fact, one MLA, member of the Delhi Assembly from the BJP, a day or two before this outburst of violence in northeast Delhi, held a rally in which this slogan was shouted, and he led it, etc. So, none of these people are arrested, of course, or anything like that. But given the extraordinary power of the state, and the police is basically a mob now in Delhi, it's extraordinary. The police is not controlled by the state. I think it's the only state in which the police is controlled by the federal home ministry. So Amit Shah, the enforcer, okay, that's his private enforcement force. Given the violence, given the danger and all that, for this not only not to disappear, but to come back with even greater force, where young people are simply absolutely ignoring the charges of treason and treachery and being anti-Hindu and so on, and embracing this vision. What I'm saying is that in this act of sticking with this Nazm, there is an embracing of an inclusive vision of South Asia, of South Asian society, okay, that crosses the borders of the nation-state system, that crosses the borders of partition. And among these very young people, many of them with not long histories in politics and so on, there's something in the culture that brings this up for them, okay, that becomes available to their consciousness in certain ways, and that being the creative, beautiful young people that they are, that they can then sort of operationalize and enact and perform in many ways. So I'm usually a very cynical person, but this is a very hopeful moment for me. It's very, very interesting. Thank you. Not cynical, sorry, skeptical. Cynical is the wrong word. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So will you take that?
Of course, it will be a pleasure, yeah.
What does this upsurge supposedly versus India being the issue of Kashmir? And is Kashmir a part of the ongoing abolitionist discourse?
Yes, Kashmir is also part of this discourse. These protests are primarily focused on these two laws. And in fact, there's a third one called the NPR, the Population Register. It's too complicated. I won't go into details how that kicks in. I don't even fully understand it. So they are focused on the citizenship question, okay? But Kashmir keeps coming up in all kinds of ways, in Shaheen Bagh in all kinds of ways. So for instance, the Dadis will say, Kashmir ke jo saath jo kuch kiya, humne kuch nahi kiya, humne kuch nahi kaha. Various other moments like this, the Babri Masjid judgment from the Supreme Court, which has given the property over to the group that wants to build the temple there. This conflict has been adjudicated in the interest of the Hindutva claimants. Humne us waqt bhi kuch nahi kaha, kuch nahi kiya, and so on. Ab nahi chup baithenge on this, okay? So there is a sense that there are a series of actions on the part of the far right, whether it's the elected government itself and their henchmen, or whether it's police, or even the Supreme Court. It's become very politicized. It's become very Hindutva-oriented in a number of its judgments. So they have a very clear sense that Kashmir is part of this. In the universities, of course, Kashmir is everywhere. Kashmir is everywhere part of the student protest. There's just no question about it. So the other thing I could have shown if I had more time, just look it up please on YouTube, okay? The most commonly chanted slogan is Azadi slogan. It's an Azadi slogan. So for instance, and there are 1,000 different lines. People invent new lines to go with it. So for instance, they'll say, Hum leke rahenge Azadi, the crowd goes Azadi. The person leading says, Hum leke rahenge, and the crowd says Azadi. And there are extraordinarily creative ways. Well, 3-4 years ago, Azadi was a Kashmiri secessionist slogan. And when it was chanted at JNU, Kanhaiya Kumar, the president of the student union, was beaten, was arrested, was charged with treason for simply saying the word Azadi on campus. Now the same slogan that Kanhaiya Kumar, this young, extraordinary man who's now become a politician in the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, the Maoist Party. He basically has turned it into a universal anti-fascism slogan and pro-democracy slogan. So the Kashmiri struggle in some ways has been incorporated into the struggle of all peoples in India, in that extraordinary gesture of linguistic inventiveness, So Kashmir is very much part of their consciousness, and they talk about it all the time. And my dear friend, Professor Nivedita Menon at JNU, Professor of Political Science, journalists have been calling for an arrest for years and things of that sort, Journalists. The ice cream is here. Yeah. So where was I, though? It's a bit hard to concentrate.
Professor
Menon, yeah. So Nivedita Menon. She has this extraordinary line. She says their position is Kashmir hamara hai, Kashmiri hamare nahi hai. That's the position. Okay? So Kashmir is the people will at universities routinely speak of it as an occupation, like the Palestinian occupation by the Israeli state and so on. Very good question, and it's very much present. And, of course, it's used again in this charge of treachery and treason and all that against whoever is using, but people are not afraid. The amazing thing that the Dadis of Shaheen Bagh have done is that the fear seems to be gone. There was fear of the BJP machinery and their henchmen. Stand-up comics were routinely saying on stage, darte, yaar, Modi sahab ko to kuch keh nahi sakte, bhakt aake marenge, or we'll go to jail, can't crack even the most innocuous jokes about Modi or Amit Shah. Now they are being ridiculed in public, at these demos, of course, but in all kinds of settings on TV and so on. For instance, Modi and Amit Shah are now being referred to as Ranga Billa publicly. Ranga Billa are the nicknames of two gangsters in Delhi in the 1980s who were executed, for the kidnapping and rape and killing of a child in the 1980s. So there are these legendary low-life gangsters, and they are being publicly identified as that. I could have showed you another extraordinary video from a Dalit political meeting, in which a group has come up with an extraordinary song in which they are referred to as Ranga Billa. That's the great accomplishment, I think, that people's fear seems to be gone. It's really the Dadis sitting there day after day, 24 hours, have somehow allowed everyone to get past their fear. This imaginary line which we are afraid to cross. That's what fear is, right? And people are crossing this line. It's an extraordinary thing. You saying something to me? No? I thought I heard. Acha, wo bol rahe hain pe. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for such an interesting
Oh, thank you.
talk. Two questions. One is a very sort of wonky question. Just about right to assembly and also maintaining.
Just about what?
Right to assembly.
Yeah.
And sort of maintaining presence, in Shanghai. I'm wondering, is it, I put it very crudely, is there a reason the authorities haven't broken up Shanghai as opposed to other protests? Partially because, I think of, Occupy Wall Street, and they were able to maintain that spot because it was a semi-private kind of place.
Shaheen Bagh?
Yeah.
No, it's not at all.
Yes.
They're occupying a stretch of road.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just
It's not private, so maybe I misunderstood you. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just wondering, I'm curious as to why the authorities haven't rounded up people more. Is it because perhaps it's totally speculative?
Now it's they who are afraid.
Yeah.
That's the extraordinary thing. They can't just go and break up Shaheen Bagh. It would take an army at this point.
Right.
All kinds of attempts have been made, of course. So what the police have done, they've put a cordon around it that completely disrupts traffic for miles. And then that gets blamed on the women, and so social pressure rises for on kind of public nuisance type reasons and so on. There are court cases by leading right-wing lawyers and stuff in the Supreme Court right now is being adjudicated that they are violating the rights of ordinary citizens and so on. They have to be removed. But if the police went in to remove them, there would be a massacre. There would be a massacre. Shaheen Bagh, okay? The difference with Northeast Delhi is that those are very mixed neighborhoods. And they are BJP neighborhoods, actually. They are neighborhoods in which the BJP won seats in this last election where they were almost wiped out. 8 seats they got out of, 67 or something like that. And all the rest went to Aam Aadmi Party and 0 to Congress. So that neighborhood is actually a BJP center, BJP Garh, and that's why we are seeing what we are seeing there, okay? In Shaheen Bagh, it's a very different kettle of fish, I think. Fingers crossed. I don't know for sure.
Just a follow-up comment.
Yeah.
It makes you think a little bit about the mothers of the disadvantaged.
Yes, of course. Of course.
That was the one line they would not cross.
Of course.
Brutal.
You mean the Madrid or in Buenos Aires? Sorry?
I'm sorry.
You mean in Madrid or in Buenos Aires? Which one are you talking about?
In Argentina.
In Argentina, yeah. This was in Madrid as well after Franco, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the power of the mother.
Yeah.
Against the
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite extraordinary. And the tragic things have happened. I mean, a child died because they're sitting out there with children overnight in the Delhi cold and all kinds of extraordinary. And they've developed a system of taking shifts and people have set up kitchens. There is the library of freely circulating books. I mean, it's a huge langar lagya, the sardars have come and set up langar and they're feeding everybody for free. People just bring food supplies, somebody brings 2 sacks of rice and whatever else. It's an extraordinary thing. And one of the other sort of, they're such petty human beings also, these right-wingers, right? I mean, they were complaining about the fact that somebody was providing free biryani to these women in the early days. There was a biryani langar kind of, and there was this thing. The biryani became an anti-national food, Probably the most widely eaten dish in India, north and south. And it became a kind of sign of the anti-national nature of these protesters. They eat biryani khaane baith ke wahan pe, Yeah.
Thank you for the talk and your reflections. I'm wondering if you can also perhaps say a little bit about Urdu being a strongly identitarian language in India. But I think that.
What do you mean by that?
So I mean, it is very strongly linked to the Muslim.
Yes and no.
Right. That's what I want.
Yes and no. Yes and no. That's the amazing thing. Until I began spending time in India, I had that impression too, okay? I think it's a Pakistani impression somehow, or preconception that we have here of what has happened to Urdu there. I mean, of course, at one level, yes, it's associated with the Muslim minority, it's Muslim families demanding access to Urdu education for their children and so on, usually, right? But there is a vast social space in which the Urdu poetic tradition is seen, I mean, I will say without hesitation, as the dominant poetic tradition of North India. The dominant one, okay? There are, of course, Hindi traditions in the classical era of various sorts in the medieval period, whether it's in Awadhi or Bhojpuri or in any of the other classical forms. I mean, this standard Hindi now is a 19th century invention, as you know. Hindi literature before that was largely Bhojpuri and Awadhi, And Bhojpuri was the one that was classic. That is to say, it was patronized by the rajas, by the courts, especially around Mathura and in that region where it's supposedly native of. So Urdu is, yes, on one hand associated with, on the other hand, just seen as part of the culture and the dominant tradition. The attachment to the ghazal tradition is mind-boggling in North India. One of the most extraordinary efforts to preserve and make available Urdu literature, criticism, and the kinds of basic linguistic knowledge that you require in order to really read and understand is in India. Online presence, right? Rekhta.org. Everybody familiar with Rekhta? It's an extraordinary thing. This is an extraordinary thing. This is a businessman who has a lot of money, and he just decided to do that. And the Mela, the annual festival, is what it is. It's a Mela. But just the site and what it does, the things it makes available now. I mean, it's my first go-to place now when I'm looking for a text that I can't find somewhere. It's my first place I go to find. They're really amazing. So, and it's actually not the only one. There are other things like that, smaller enterprises and efforts of that sort. And I think that, that perception is also, that resentment is also there, and this fierce attachment to Faisal. There's this resentment कि ये कौन होते हैं हमको इससे रोकने वाले? This is our stuff. There are people who are in the way of Agha Shahid Ali writing ghazals in English in India now. Very beautiful things, including, for instance, when this very brutal murder of a Muslim man took place outside Delhi, who was accused of having beef in his freezer, a man named Muhammad Akhlaq. I don't know if people remember. Soon after the BJP came to power, and the Prime Minister was silent, never said a word about this, for weeks. In response to that, there was an extraordinary English ghazal dedicated to this man, and to this event and what it means. So Urdu can't be eliminated. I always say to people say to me very often, Urdu khatam ho rahi hai. They cannot do that. It will not happen, not under present circumstances. Who knows if there's a genocide, what that means. Which is not impossible, of course. But given the current demography and the current state of the culture, you can oppress it, you can make it disappear from schools, children can't write in Urdu script, but everything is now becoming available in Devanagari. I mean, I think actually that's amazing, The purists, the UP Shurafa, they like, hamari script khatam ho rahi hai, Rasmul khatam ho rahi hai. I think that's a very bad judgment, in fact. It's amazing that everything is made available in Devanagari now. Extraordinary things. I mean, really, just the entire classical tradition, and it's just a standard practice for all these things to be published in Devanagari. So, in fact, there's a very large audience being developed for returning to even reading, not just listening to Urdu poetry. I mean, Urdu poetry, as we know, is mostly listened to rather than read. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, it's through song that I encountered the ghazal. I mean, I had a stupid colonial education, but for most people, I think, who've even had a decent Urdu literature education in school and so on, they will mostly have experienced the ghazal through song, right, rather than through sort of solitary act of reading or something, So Urdu can't be eliminated, and it can't be simply. They keep trying to make it into the foreign tongue and the alien tongue and the enemy's tongue and so on and so forth, right? You hear crazy things that it's a language descended from Arabic. And, I mean, you hear crazy things on the right in India. But it's embedded. I'm very hopeful about that as well. It's really very embedded. And it's the place where this pan-South Asian imagining becomes possible, We're not talking about doing away with partition. We're not talking about doing away with the borders. But this hell of conflict, that we're living through, and unending conflict and violence and separation. Urdu is the place, I think, where this. I mean, there are others. There's Bangla, of course. There's Punjabi now in this extraordinary way between Indian Sikh and Pakistani Punjabi Muslim communities. That's another whole thing, by the way, that I think is an extraordinary thing because of this whole Kartarpur and Navjot Singh Sidhu, who's so awesome, his visits to Pakistan and all that. So that's another sector in which this kind of cross-border thing is taking place. But Urdu is this thing, I think, as a cultural phenomenon and a cultural system that spans this great northern expanse, from the borders of Bengal, let's say, all the way here. It can't be removed. can't be removed without a great deal of violence. I mean, 70 years of disenfranchisement, removal of funding and resources, scapegoating, tarring it with the brush of treason, and if that can't produce the results they want, I don't think they can do it. And that's the other thing, about Hindutva as a political ideology and culture. And really all totalitarian politics, it seems to me. The closer they come to total power, like this election, right, in which they returned with a kind of freestanding majority without any need for a coalition and so on. I hope I'm not misspeaking, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case. The closer they actually come to realize, this is the problem with fantasies of total power. The closer you come to realizing it, the more anguished you get that you don't actually have it. The closer you come to having it, the greater that absence and distance seems. And a lot of the pathologies that we see in right-wing politics in India are about that. The more powerful they get, the more desperate they get, that they are not all-powerful. That not everybody is subdued, not everybody is subjecting themselves to their will, and so on. Same thing here. And it's not just the state, it can happen in shall I say, religious cultures or, whatever else. I mean, in micro-political cultures it can happen, of course, in the same way. So that's the pathology of totalitarian power. You can, I'm a student of European fascism now, because of what's been happening in Europe and America, and now in India. I've been sort of really doing a lot of work now on that, and teaching courses and writing a book and so on. That's precisely the pathology of totalitarian power in Europe in the 30s and 40s, and all the great writers and thinkers understood it. Bertolt Brecht, his great play, The Irresistible Rise of Arturo Ui, is precisely about this thing. The more power you have, the more desperate you get that you don't have total power. It's a basic psychological weirdness of totalitarian fantasies of power, it seems to me. Anyway, I think I've bored you guys enough. Oh, one more, okay? Okay. There's one in the back. I mean, I don't mind at all. But don't you have to go, though?
Well, we can go in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
This is just a comment.
Okay.
Thank you so much for personalizing
Thank you.
everything.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The poetic and the literary side of it. I'd just like to say that it makes this particular piece of poem, it revives an interest in Teresa's own life.
Yeah.
At the moment that he could write something which could so easily be turned into songs of protest.
Yeah.
And the language used, and that, so it's kindling a lot of interest in Faize's own repertoire and writing and life and moments and stages. Yeah, that is all.
By the way, just to add a little thing, so this thing of Urdu script and all that. So all these young people that are reading and reciting Faiz, they're reading it in Devanagari. When that young girl they're reading it in Devanagari script, obviously, okay? That's the way in which Urdu poetry is now disseminated, okay? It's in Devanagari.
Was there another question? Thank you so much for your talk. I was thinking of a lot of different threads that came up in this talk. Just in terms of the poetry, for example, last year when there was Student Solidarity March happening here in Lahore,
Yeah.
one of the videos that was shared the most before the march was of this activist reciting Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna by Bismillah.
That's right, well, Bismillah, yeah.
And she's standing right outside Faiz Festival, but instead of singing Faiz, she's singing Bismillah. And same with Kanhaiya, when he was arrested, it was in relation to a poem with Ala Shahid Ali in Delhi. So I guess my question is, do you think there is something particular to the form or genre of poetry in North India that allows it to be this marker of fluidity?
Okay, so this is what I would say. The Urdu poetic tradition, uniquely perhaps in South Asia, is absolutely, sorry, it's a big word, a little bit awkward word, unassimilable to the nation-state system. Urdu uniquely cannot be divided in this way, okay? And I think it's not just Urdu. Of course it's not just Urdu. But in Urdu, it's very hard. In other words, literary value in Urdu is linked to it's not being nationalistic. If you have a good nationalistic poem, nobody will say, this is a great nazm, Nobody. I mean, not even nationalists will say it's a great nazm, okay? There is something about this literary culture which is fundamentally inimical to the cultural categories of the nation-state system, okay? And the way in which the rise of nationalism, first Indian Hindu majority nationalism and then Muslim separatist nationalism, sought to rearrange and divide culture and civilization in the subcontinent in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I don't want to use the word resistance. That suggests too deliberate and methodical a response. There's something built into this linguistic culture which is of that nature. Of course, every language, Bangla, Punjabi, which were divided, have suffered immensely because of that division, right? I mean, in Punjabi there's a division of script, for instance, right? But also of vocabulary in many ways. In Bangla, I believe it's much less. I'm not an expert, but I believe it's much less of a division. I mean, a Tagore poem is the national anthem of Bangladesh, so it's that too can cross, that culture too can cross borders in certain ways. But I think there is a distinct flavor to that issue in Urdu culture. It's an exilic language, It's really an exilic language if you think about it. Of course, here it's part of this powerful national project and being imposed on every other linguistic culture and all of that. And yet, everybody understands it's not the mother tongue of very many people, numerically speaking, in this country. It is a language from across the border. Its historical origins are in North India, to some extent here, of course, as well. There is that old argument about Punjab mein Urdu and all that. Slightly self-serving argument, I think, in the sense that, anyway, that's a whole other question. So that's what I would say, that it's a language in which the relationship of a people to a language, to a place, is not a settled one. I mean, think about the way in which Urdu was reinvented after partition. Here, it became the national language of this project, with all the violence and all the contradictions that come with imposing a national language on a multilingual population. But it's much more successful in this violent imposition than Hindi is, by the way, in India. Much more. Because sorry?
Except for Bangladesh.
What do you mean?
Well, Bangladesh was the biggest thing in Pakistani, the imposition.
No, I mean here. You're absolutely right. Of course. That's the thing. That's absolutely right. Maulvi Abdul Haq, this great servant of the Urdu language, he spent decades in India before partition promoting Urdu and saying, no, it's a shared language and this and that, and finally gives up, he was the follower of Gandhi, finally gives all that up and he comes to Pakistan, this little venerable Maulana, brings his operation from Hyderabad, the state, to Pakistan and so on. And then he discovers that even here it's a foreign language, it's an alien language, and the Bengalis are saying, what the hell? I mean, it's not our language, certainly, So he's really, I've written about his writings of this period. It's like a befuddlement, like what happened here, I thought this was going to settle this problem. Sorry, very long answer to a short question. G, sorry?
The last comment,
Yeah, of course, yeah. That's right. So that's the thing, right? At the spoken level, two people can be talking to each other. One thinks they are speaking Hindi, the other thinks they're speaking Urdu. Of course, that's the fact. We all know that. It's one of the most peculiar linguistic conflicts, really, in the world. I have linguist friends who tell me there are similar ones. The Serbo-Croatian, for instance, So the Serbians call it Serbian, and the Croats call it Croat, and the Bosnian Muslims call it the Balkan language. So these three populations are speaking essentially the same language, but they're in this tiny place, right? And they have three different names for it. But they have different scripts as well. The Croats use the Latin, and the Serbians use the Slavic. Okay, I will let you guys go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.